Okay, we are going to. Oh, wait a second. I don't think I'm here. One minute. Um, there we go. Okay. Um, if you went to shul yesterday and followed the Parshat Bo, you saw that it was the final plagues, and then a major part of the parsha was the declaration of uh, the first month of the year of the national religious calendar. You know that we have two calendars. We have a solar calendar, which we share with all of the other nations. That's based on the sun's the cycle of us around the sun, which is 365 days typically, a few hours. And then there is a second calendar that much of the ancient Near East kept, which was a lunar calendar, which was based on the cycles of the moon rather than the sun. So the solar calendar was an agricultural calendar because that had to do with the seasons. It had to do with fall and winter and spring and summer and had to do with nature. It had to do with when things grow and bloom and when you have to seed and all of that. The lunar calendar was not. The lunar calendar was one in which we created for us. That starts in the month of Nisan, which is the month of Yetziat Mitzrayim, and that's to be for us the first month of the year. So if there are 12 months, our first month starts with Nisan and then ends with Adar, which is the 12th month, while everybody else's calendar was a solar calendar. Um, well, I you can't say that. Other other um, civilizations and cultures of the ancient Near East also had these months, but the the they didn't have two separate calendars. In other words, whatever was the first, like for example, in our secular calendar, January is the first month of the year, but it's also the beginning of the year. So we count years by January 1st and we count months by January 1st. In our calendar, the Jewish calendar, we count months by Nisan, and by the way, all the months in the Chumash are by that number. There's no names of months. There are descriptions of months. So you have Chag HaAviv, you have a spring month, but the name of the months come later from the Babylonian calendar. Our names of the months, Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz, of Elul, all of those are Babylonian names. But the months of the year start in Nisan, that's the first month. But the year, when we count years, the years start with Rosh Hashanah, which is the seventh month. So we have two separate calendars, an annual solar calendar and an annual lunar calendar. And then, of course, it gets messed up because if we start counting yearly cycles of the moon, there are less days in a yearly cycle than there are in the sun. Sun is 365 days in some hours, and a lunar calendar is about 8 days shorter than that. So we have to adjust it, and that becomes in our calendar, that becomes leap years, which every three times, I think in 19 years or something like that, they adjust to second Adar to make sure that Nisan remains Chag Aviv, the spring festival, that Pesach has to come out in the spring. So, in any case, it's a complicated system that used to be by witnesses would declare months, which was not a very efficient system. But then Hillel II established a calendar that actually wasn't based on witnesses, but based on knowing what the months are going to be, how many days is going to be the months, when there has to be leap years and all of that. And that's the calendar that we use today. But in any case, my point is that this Parshat Bo introduces the lunar calendar, and it's a calendar that's unique to the Jewish nation. In other words, it's our calendar because it indicates the beginning of the birth of the nation of Israel. Israel was born in Nisan on the 15th of Nisan, and that becomes our spiritual calendar, our religious calendar. And our holidays are a combination of the solar and lunar calendars because we have to we have agricultural holidays like holidays like Sukkot, and we have spring holidays like Pesach and Shavuot. So the two have to be adjusted so that they come together. But we do have two calendars, and the calendar of Nisan is introduced in this parsha. Okay, but now our task is to study these 10 plagues, the remaining plagues, but the whole system of plagues. Now, remember we talked last week that this whole issue of plagues on Egypt, excuse me, the plagues on Egypt were based on understanding the culture of Egypt. In other words, the plagues were not just on Pharaoh, we'll see, but were also on the gods of Egypt. Okay, and so before we get to the plagues, though, I want uh, to tell you some interesting oddity that's related to what we saw last week and what we see this week. The expression of "Vayichabed et libo," that Pharaoh's heart, either he hardened his own heart or God hardened his heart. Um, the word "Vayichabed et libo," "Vayichabed" means heavy, right? Chabed, if something is heavy, it's chaf bet dalin. Okay. Now, also is related to the word respect, kabed et avicha v'et imecha, and Hirsch has a whole analysis of what the connection is between the two. But in any case, the source word of chaf bet dalit is heavy. Okay, so the phrase can be translated is either Pharaoh made his own heart heavy, vayichabed et libo, or in the last set of plagues, God made his heart heavy. Okay, so if you noticed in this parsha, there was another expression used for the last plagues, vayechazek et libo. Vayechazek is actually the much better word. It means to strengthen someone's heart, meaning to make them stubborn or resistant. Vayichabed, vayechazek et libo means he made his heart resistant to change, or God made his heart resistant to change. And that word is used, vayechazak. So the question is, where did this expression come from, vayechabed et libo? If there's, in other words, it's a better word to say vayechazek et libo is a better word if we wanted to use those words. But there is a Egyptian source of this word, vayechabed et libo, and if we're all the plagues and all the things that happened to Egypt are related to the gods of Egypt. It was against Pharaoh and his gods. Okay, so what would Vayichabed et libo mean within the Egyptian context? So I once saw, about 3 years ago, I saw um, a presentation at the Israel Museum of ancient Egypt and its gods. And on the wall, they had the history, they had the story of what happens to a pharaoh when the pharaoh dies and is embalmed. So, what happens is his organs are taken out. His heart is taken and put into a jar, and his liver is taken out, and so forth. And then the rest of the body is embalmed. But the whole idea of the mythology is then Pharaoh's soul, as it were, is it goes on a journey. It's on its journey to eternity. Okay, but in the on the journey, the uh, the soul of the pharaoh is goes through judgment, and the person, the god who judges the pharaoh is Osiris, and Osiris takes the heart. You see on the left side is the jar which contains the heart of the pharaoh, and he puts the heart of the pharaoh on one side of a scale, and the scale is controlled by another god called Mat, who then puts a feather. You look on the right side, there's a feather on the other side of the scale. So the heart is on one side and the feather's on the other. And the way it works, the god Mat, who's in charge of justice, says that if the feather weighs more than the heart, then the pharaoh can continue on his journey to the eternal world. However, if the heart is heavier than the feather, then the heart is taken out by the god Mat and given to another god who has a head of a crocodile, and that god eats the heart of the pharaoh, and pharaoh ceases to exist. There's no soul anymore. End of the journey, and the pharaoh ceases to exist. So what does that have to do with this? Is how does the pharaoh's heart become heavy? It becomes heavy when he does evil to his own people, when he's not a good pharaoh. In other words, when he does not treat his people well and doesn't um, affect his job as being the leader of the Egyptian people, but rather causes them uh, pain and anguish, then his heart becomes heavy. And if we see the story, if you remember the story, after the first couple of plagues, the people started to complain to Pharaoh and said, get rid of these people, let them go and let them serve their God for 3 days and stop these plagues because we're the ones who are suffering. And Pharaoh is resistant, and he's vayichabed et libo. He makes his heart heavy, meaning he makes his heart sin, and his heart becomes heavier every time he refuses to let the people go in order to do something good for his nation. And then eventually, as we discussed last week, God is the one who sort of forces him into a position to keep going, even though he would rather let them go. But he's God takes over and forces him to continue with the plagues in order to, well, we'll see what the plagues do, but he has to continue to resist letting the people go, which means his own people are suffering more and more. And his heart, therefore, has become heavier and heavier. So that when he dies, his heart is going to be heavy on that side of the scale, and his punishment is that he ceases to exist. So the expression "Vayechabed et lev paro" is a expression specifically related to Egyptian mythology. The Hebrew would just use the word "Vayechazek et lev paro" all the time, but using the word "Vayechabed" is to relate it to this kind of mythology, the punishment that Pharaoh ultimately is going to get. So very
Interesting.
interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yes, too. Thank you. That's fascinating insight. Yeah.
it is, and it explains the expression better than anybody else. Okay, so now let's go back to the plagues. This whole experience of slavery we discussed also last week. The whole experience of slavery is based on the prophetic experience and vision that God gave to Abraham. So God says to Abraham, know for certain that for 400 years, it's actually 210 years, but it depends where you start counting. Your descendants will be, and then God describes to Abraham three conditions. First of all, they're going to be strangers in a country that's not their own. In other words, they're going to be outside of Canaan, and they're going to be in another country, and they're going to have no rights of citizens. They are going to be foreigners in that country and remain foreigners. Number two, they're going to be enslaved by those people. And number three, not only will they be enslaved, but they're also going to be mistreated. They're going to be abused and oppressed by their taskmasters. And then God says, but I will punish the nation they serve as slaves. In other words, I'm going to then judge that nation for doing that to you. And afterward, the Bnei Israel will come out with rechush gadol, with great possessions. You, though, Avraham, he's talking to Avraham, you will die in peace and you'll be buried at a good old age. In other words, this is going to happen 3 generations later, and it's not for now, but that's what's going to happen. So these three conditions, they're going to have no citizen rights, they're going to be enslaved, and they're going to be mistreated, and that God is going to punish those who do that to the Bnei Israel. So our first question is, why punish the Egyptians by 10 plagues? There are two easier, more effective methods of punishing the Egyptians. One is skip the first 9 plagues and tell Moshe to tell Pharaoh at his first meeting, this is God speaking, release my firstborn people, B'ni Bechori Yisrael. Israel is my firstborn. Or else, from your animals to your servants to your own child shall die. All your firstborns, whether it's from your house, from the royal house, or from all of the Egyptians, or all of your servants, they're going to die. So in other words, skip the first 9, go to the 10th one, and say, either you let my people go and worship me for 3 days like I'm asking you, or this is what's going to happen to you. Okay. God didn't choose to do it that way. He didn't want Pharaoh to let the people go at the beginning. He wanted the 9 plagues, the additional 9 plagues before he let them go. Or, second thing, is God could have simply instructed the Bnei Israel to walk out of Egypt during the 3 days of darkness. Remember, the darkness only affected the Egyptians. It says that. It's not a medrash. The text says that the Bnei Israel in Goshen had light. They didn't have a problem. But for the rest of Egypt, when it says days of darkness, it means that they couldn't see anything. In other words, it was like a blackout or a blindness. So if the people of Egypt could not see anything, the Bnei Israel theoretically, who could just walk out of Egypt. Okay, but again, that's not the plan. Even though either of these alternatives would have affected Yetziat Mitzrayim faster and immediately, God did not do it this way. Question is, why not? So here we have to look at the purpose of the plagues. When Moshe first goes to Pharaoh and he said, the God of the Hebrews appeared to me and he told me to tell you, Pharaoh, to let his people, the Hebrews, go for 3 days to worship him in the desert. And Pharaoh's response, understandably, was, who is this God? I never heard of him. Why should I obey him? Why should I let the Israelites go? I don't know this God, and I certainly am not going to let slaves go. So, but that's an understandable response.
Steve,
Yeah.
Didn't the descendants of the the children of Israel, not worship, but they'd kept the names and they'd kept the way of dressing. So he must have known they worshipped a god.
Yeah, but neither Israel or Pharaoh has never heard of this God. Remember that Moshe had to ask God, what should I tell the Bnei Israel? You've never appeared for 3 generations. What's your name? How are they supposed to know you? So they didn't know. The Israelites didn't know God, had no connection to God. They
So
knew
why did they
their
keep
identity. They knew their
why?
identity.
Oh, that
They
was
knew
it.
they came from Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov,
And that was
and they were the children of Yaakov. That they knew, but
it.
they didn't know God. God did not appear to them. God did not speak to them. God did not say anything to them. For 3 whole generations, they were slaves. Their parents were slaves. Their grandparents were slaves, and most likely their great grandparents were slaves.
It also isn't what Rose is referring to really Midrash from Rashi?
Yes, yes, but regardless, the Midrash says, well, how did they keep their identity? They
Yeah.
kept their names, they kept their clothing, and okay, that's Midrash. It's not the Chumash, but from the Chumash we know that the Bnei Israel were an identified group. They knew they were identified as Israelites. It was an identified group, and they kept their identity. Now, the big question is, did they worship
Oh.
the Egyptian gods? Did they worship any god? They didn't know about their own God.
How
There's
did
no
they keep their
indication.
identity?
There's no indication of worship.
Yeah, but how did they keep their identity with how they?
They kept their identity by knowing who they're. Just like anybody. Indians, American Indians, don't have really a connection to their ancestors, but they know they're Apache Indians and they're Sioux Indians. They know all these things, and so they keep their identity, but they don't behave that way. I mean, you can't tell an Apache who's an American that he has Apache ancestors, but he knows his identity. He's an Apache. Okay, so the Bnei Israel knew their identity, but they didn't have any connection to their God, and certainly the Egyptians never heard of a Hebrew God because he never appeared to anybody. This is the first time he's going to appear to them. And so his Pharaoh's reaction is a fair reaction. And God says, but I have a plan. I know Pharaoh is going to respond this way. I know he'll not listen to you. And that's purposeful because I want to lay my hand on Egypt with mighty acts of judgment and bring out my divisions, meaning my people, the Israelites. And the Egyptians will know that I am God. I need to do these plagues in order for the Egyptians to know that I am God and their gods that they believe in are subservient to me. I am the ultimate God, and their gods will have no power. And that is what I want to prove to him. And then in chapter 12, it says the same thing in our Parsha. On that, we're talking about the last one. On that same night, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. So not only on Pharaoh, but God is going to bring judgment against all the gods of Egypt. And then when this whole thing is reviewed in Sefer Bamidbar, when the Israelites set out from Ramses on the 15th of Nisan, they marched in full view of all the Egyptians who were burying their firstborn, whom God had struck down among them, because God had brought judgment on their gods. In other words, the focus of the plagues were on Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt. And this is repeated 10 different repetitions from chapter 7 all the way through chapter 12. It's repeated over and over again that God is punishing Pharaoh, the Egyptians, and the gods of Egypt. Okay, now, what does it mean that the Egyptians will know that I am God? What do you mean, know? Know, the word yada, yud daled, ayin. To know something is a word that's used with different nuances. When's the first time it's used? Anybody remember the first? I didn't hear that.
Adam and Hava.
You're not coming in clearly. It's
Adam and Eve.
Adam and Eve. Correct. It's Adam yada et Chava, that he knew his wife. So it's used as an intimate knowing, not a cognitive knowledge, not an abstract knowing something like you know things, but it's a nuance of an intimate knowing, and it's also used with later on in history with Avram. Remember, right before Sodom, God says to Abraham, "Ki yidativ," because I have an intimate connection to him. I know him well. The intimate knowing is to know somebody fully, which is why it's often used as lovers claim about each other. I know you, meaning I know you intimately. I know you very, very well. To have intimate knowledge of an event, therefore, is to comprehend it completely and absorb its essential meaning into one's mind. In other words, the Egyptians will know that I am God. It won't be a theoretical notion. It'll be something that they know as fact, something that they actually experience and that they know well. So God did not wish Pharaoh to simply release the Bnei Israel in a thoughtless, forced manner. In other words, if God came in with that, skip the 9 plagues, and came in just with the last one and says, either you leave my people go, or I'm going to kill all of the firstborn in royalty and everybody else. Okay, but God didn't want him to release the Bnei Israel that way, because he wouldn't have learned anything. Rather, God wished to teach the Egyptians and the surrounding nations and the Israelites themselves certain critical lessons about himself and his relationship to his people and his words. So there's really 3 audiences. There's Pharaoh and the Egyptians, there's the surrounding nations, and there's the Bnei Israel, who grew up for 3 generations under the gods of Egypt. Now, why would it be important that God wants to also teach the surrounding nations about the Hebrew God, about the God of the Israelites? Think about that for a minute. Why is that important? Not just
Protection.
what?
Protection as they go out.
Yeah, because what are they going to do? What's the plan? The plan is
Take over.
right, take over Canaan. The plan is that was the plan, that God is going to take them out of Egypt, and then they're within 2 years they're going to reach Canaan and start the process of taking over Canaan. Okay, but the Bnei Israel have to learn that God's going to be on their side, and the Canaanite nations have to learn that God, the Hebrew God, is a powerful God, and that he's more powerful. If he's more powerful than the Egyptian gods, he's certainly more powerful than our Canaanite gods. So it was a lesson also to the surrounding nations, and we'll see if that how effective that was. But it was also for the Bnei Israel, because they have to know that God is all powerful, and if God can now be more powerful than the Egyptian gods that they grew up under, then we can certainly believe that God is going to be powerful enough to help us conquer the Canaanite nations and their gods. So it was a educational experience. The plagues were an educational experience. So if we look at it this way, let's look at the plagues. The water turns to blood is dumb. Tzfardea is the frogs that come out of the Nile and go into all the houses and everything. Lice or gnats is the kinim. Flies, or there's not clear from the text what arov was. Seems to be the more academic argument that arov is a mixture of all kinds of insects that are, biting insects that are unpleasant insects. Others say it's a mixture of animals or wild animals. It's not likely that it's wild animals because Egypt didn't have wild animals like that. So it's most likely some kind of insects. Then there was a disease of the livestock called dever, and then there was boils on the skin of the people that were unhealable. Then there was hail and thunder and lightning, the barad. Then there was locusts who covered the whole sky. Then there was choshech, this deep darkness in which you couldn't see anything. And then finally there was the death of the firstborn. And the simanim is ditzach, adash, v'achab, the first letter of all, but it was in groups of three. Ditzach was one group of three, adash was another group of three, and the barad, arba, and choshech was the last group of three, and then the 10th was makat bechorot. So that's the grouping. Now, why is it put in that grouping? So now, whole point of this is, first of all, let's take a look at what the plagues are, and then we'll take a look at the grouping. There was a plague previous to Dam that we overlook. But you remember when Moshe first came to Pharaoh, his rod, his staff, turned into a snake. Remember that? And then the magicians did the same thing. They made their rods turn into snakes, but Moshe's rod ate theirs. In other words, although the magicians could take snakes and sort of paralyze them so they look like a rod, Moshe's ate theirs. So what's that a symbol of? The snake, or the cobra, was a symbol of the ruling power. If you've gone to the archaeological sections of the museums, you'd see that the cobra motif is found in Egyptian art, and it was on the forehead of Pharaoh's crown, a cobra ready to strike. You see the picture. I took these pictures from the internet. You see on top of Pharaoh's headdress is a cobra's head. On the throne of King Tut is also a coiled cobra ready to strike. And so the fact that Moshe's cobras, as it were, ate theirs was a symbol that Moshe's God is going to overcome the power of Pharaoh. It was a pre-plague. It was something that is saying that the whole experience is going to show that the power of the Hebrew God is greater than the power of Pharaoh. The Nile, as a water god called Hapi, was a deity of fertility. Why? Because the Nile provided water, the water provided food, and the yearly inundation of the Nile was critical in order to provide water and food for the Egyptian population. That's why when they had 7 years of famine way back when, it was the Nile did not overflow and did not provide water, and that created the crisis. But normally, the Nile overflows every year, and that provides water and food, and the god in charge of the Nile, Hapi, was in charge of having the Nile overflow and provide water. And it was such a critical god. It was up there in the hierarchy of gods, even above Ra, which was the sun god. In other words, you'd have to have both. You have to have food. You have to have water, and you have to have sun. Both of those things, and therefore the two major gods of Egypt was Ra, the sun god, and Hapi, the god of the Nile. The frog, called Heket, was a goddess of childbirth, of the creation and grain germination. In other words, anything that had to do with reproduction, birth and reproduction. And this goddess was depicted as a frog, or a woman with the head of a frog, which was connected to the Nile, because the Nile would provide water so that things could grow, and Heket, the goddess, would provide the fertility that made the wheat grow and fertilize the land and the produce. Okay, and most likely the servants of Heket, the priestesses of Heket, were the midwives, because they're the ones in charge of fertility. Okay, so the frog itself was a goddess. And then the other biggest god was the god of the sun. That's what Ramses, the Egyptian pharaoh in our story, was named after Ra. Ramses, remember when we talked about Moshe's name, MSS in Hebrew, in Egyptian hieroglyphics means sun, S-O-N. So Ramses means the son of Ra. So Pharaoh was called the son of Ra. So the fact that there was 3 days of darkness means that the sun had no power. The sun god Ra, the main god Ra, had no power over over Egypt. That the Hebrew God had stopped Ra from shining. So that was like the 9th plague before the 10th plague of Makat Bekorot, because it was the major plague against the Egyptian gods. But the other ones, each of the plagues, were directed towards a god. And just to go through this very quickly, the other gods, you can check all this out on the internet. Will show you, this is where I got it from, that the ancient gods of Egypt, were the gods that were related to the plagues. The flies, or the beetles, the insects, the arov, was the scarabs. Scarabs were golden scarabs were worn by priests and pharaohs and they were regarded as manifestations of Ra, and or the fly was also a god. There was a fly god. As a symbol of bravery, soldiers who had proven themselves were decorated with a golden fly. So now, if flies and beetles come and they are negative, that they sting people and they create all kinds of havoc, then it means that this god was defanged. In other words, the gods could not protect the people from flies or beetles. The uh, the cattle died from anthrax. We know that disease, and it was a judgment against the bull god and the sacred cattle of Hathor. It was a cow-headed love goddess, and it was a special reproach to Pharaoh, who worshipped Hathor as the goddess. The most likely the Egel Hazahav was related to Hathor, was the calf of the sacred cattle of Hathor. Now remember, the Bnei Israel knew all of this. They were raised under all of this. This was not something that was different from their knowledge. They knew about Hathor. They knew about um, scarabs. They knew about all of these gods. The boils is against the god of healing. Imhotep is a god of healing, which was an outstanding a god of the Old Kingdom, and therefore, if the priests could not cure themselves of boils, it means that the god of healing was impotent. The god of healing could not heal them, even though they were priests. So again, the God of Israel is showing that their gods are ineffective. Hail was the sky goddess. Nut was the mother of Ra. Okay, and her job was to swallow the sun in the evening. That's how they saw the sun disappearing. It was swallowed by his mother, and then she gave birth to him again in the morning, and so the sun rises. And that was a daily cycle. Okay, so the plague which caused havoc from the sky was against the goddess, the mother of Ra, because she was supposed to protect the land from destruction, and she couldn't. Okay, so the sun goddess was rendered impotent by the God of Israel. Grasshoppers or locusts. Okay, the effect of the locusts were not the locusts themselves, but it was because it was so thick that you couldn't see the sky, and that's the another idea of choshech. It was like a pre-choshech. It was the sun god Ra was occluded by the locusts that caused darkness while the sun was shining. So Ra was discredited because Ra couldn't shine through the locusts. Okay, so the point number one is that all of the plagues were related to gods of Egypt who were supposed to either provide blessing or protection or healing or to the people, and in each one of those the gods were shown to be ineffective, that the Hebrew God was able to knock out the powers of all of these different gods. Now, let's look at the organization. Why were they presented in that particular organized number? What's the pattern that are evident in the series of the plagues? And since these patterns cannot be arbitrary, what's the meaning? In other words, there is a pattern of the plagues. The Ditzak, Adash Bagav, the patterns of three sets of three, before the final one, is a purposeful pattern. So what's the purpose of the pattern? Now is where we have to go back to what we saw in the beginning. God's statement to Abram is that for this period of time, they're going to be strangers in a country not their own. They're going to have no citizen rights. They're going to be enslaved, and they're going to be mistreated. Okay, so those are the three conditions that have to happen before God is going to then evoke his judgments and his punishments against the people, the Egyptians, for enslaving them. So the first is Gerut. Gerut, you're going to be a ger in the country, in a country that's not your own. So the status of an alien, the Egyptians denied the Bnei Israel the rights of citizens. Okay, now pay attention to this. The Egyptians denied Bnei Israel the rights of citizens. What's the rights of a citizen? If you were an Egyptian, you could use natural resources, you can live in safety, and you can freely participate in the economy of the nation. So what does God do by these plagues? He disrupts their civil rights by making their water undrinkable, denying them their natural resources, by sending either wild beasts or insects against them, denying their safety, and by destroying their crops, denying them the ability to have a functional economy. Okay? In other words, the plagues, the three of the plagues, were addressed to Mida Keneged Mida, just like you denied the Israelites the rights of citizenship and the rights that you have, I take away those rights that you have. What about the enslavement? Well, the oppressive enslavement, they denied the Bnei Israel personal freedom. If you're a slave, you don't have any freedom. So God disrupts the Egyptians' rights to privacy. Frogs invade their houses, to private property, their livestock dies, and the right to provide food for one's own needs, their new crop is destroyed by locusts. In other words, you deny the Israelites the rights to personal property and the rights to privacy and the rights to have their own economy, and therefore God's going to take that away from you. And the final one is Inui, that you mistreated. And here, the plagues that are directed against Inui are plagues that are not against the gods mostly, but but causes this actual physical suffering of the Egyptians. And there was no warning here. This was not as a lesson to Pharaoh, but it was a punishment for their intentional inhumane treatment of the Bnei Israel. In other words, it's understandable perhaps that they could enslave the Bnei Israel, but the fact that they oppressed them and the fact that they mistreated them and the fact that they afflicted them so harshly, that they are responsible themselves for, and that they're going to get Mida Keneged Mida from God. God's going to make them suffer bodily, just as they made the Bnei Israel suffer bodily. So now, if you make a table and take a look at the organization here, it makes sense. The blood and the orov and the dever are all focused on taking away the rights of citizenships of the Egyptians because they took it away from the Israelites. The frogs, the anthrax, the locusts are all about taking away the personal freedoms of the Egyptians, like they took the personal freedoms away from the Bnei Israel by making them slaves. And the third group is the bodily afflictions, the lice, the boils, and the darkness, which essentially was blindness. You took away sight from each of the Egyptians. And so the organization and the types of plagues reflect the three things that the Egyptians did to the Bnei Israel, and the three things that God, Mida Keneged Mida, punishes Egypt and Pharaoh. Now there's more to the organization. That's when you read it down, going down. When you read it across, there's also a purposeful organization of reading it across. The first three, Dam, Tzvardea, and Kinim, reflect the pasuk that it says in chapter 7, they'll know that I am God who can disrupt your resources within the earth. These three things, blood, Tzvardea, and Kinim, came out of the earth. They came out of the water, they came out of the water itself, the Nile, and the lice. Comes out of dust. Remember, that's how Aaron took dust, threw it up, and they turned into lice. So those show that God is the power over the earth. Then, going across the second set of three, reflects the pasuk that says, know that I am God who can disrupt animal and human life on earth. So the flies or the wild beasts disrupt their safety, the anthrax disrupts all their cattle, and the boils gives them the skin disease. So it was the second set focuses on those things which are on the earth. And the third set, as we can predict, is going to be coming from the sky, is going to be above the earth. Know that I am God who can disrupt atmospheric conditions above the earth. The hail, the locust, and the darkness all come from above, all come from the sky. So all of these are set up in a particular organizational pattern to show that God is the God of everything that comes from the earth, everything that's on the earth, and everything that's over the earth. So what's the final lesson? The final lesson is the 10th on the Makat Bechorot. And Moshe says to the people, this is what God says. About midnight, I will go through Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on the throne to the firstborn of the female slave who is at her hand mill, and all the firstborn of all the cattle as well. And there will be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there ever has been and ever will be again. In other words, everybody, as well as the animals, are going to lose their firstborn child or animal or whatever's firstborn.
Steve, can I just stop you while you're talking about
Yeah.
that? I noticed yesterday I was reading the Stone edition,
Yeah.
and it just says every firstborn. It doesn't say every firstborn son. And I was going to ask, if it is every firstborn and not every firstborn son, why do we have a pigeon of Ben?
The plague is on every firstborn in Egypt,
Yeah,
right? But when it talks about therefore the mitzvah of Pidyon Haben, therefore how we commemorate that within our mitzvah system is by dedicating the firstborn male, right, of your cattle and of your own child, and of course the child has to be redeemed.
yeah.
Right. So, but in other words, that's where it has to be a son. So when a Jewish mother gives birth, and the firstborn is a son, then there has to be Pidyon Haben. If it's a firstborn is a daughter, then nothing happens. So the firstborn of the plague was really was the firstborn. The assumption that it was the firstborn son because that was the one who takes over the family and leads the family. The firstborn is always the chosen one in a family, or the strongest of the cattle, or the sheeps and the goats. The firstborn is the strongest, and they're the ones that God's going to destroy, and therefore um, uh, the Bnei Israel have to remember that God saved them by dedicating their own
It's
to
a
God.
sweet
That's
explanation.
the connection between the two.
Because it says here, because I don't read all the Rashi, I can't read Rashi at all.
Yeah,
It says here, every firstborn shall die, even the firstborn of the poor, underprivileged would die, foreign captives, though they would not attribute their survival to the power of their idols. The firstborn children of lowly Egyptian maidservants, because they too enjoy the suffering of the Jews, and
right,
the firstborn of animals, because the Egyptians worshipped them,
right,
and God exacts judgment against the gods of the sinners. So it sounds as though it was
correct.
just all firstborns.
No, the firstborn sons of all of these, who are the
No, but it just
focus of.
said, it doesn't say firstborn sons, it's just all firstborns. In the stone Chumash.
Um, let's let me just look it up for a second. 11:4.
And it just puzzled me. You know, we talked about
I know,
it.
yeah. Usually, I mean, the firstborn always refers to the firstborn
Number
son.
5.
11:4. Um, yeah,
Hmm?
it doesn't say son, it says Bechor, but Bechor is in biblical culture, in biblical Hebrew, a Bechor is always the firstborn son because the girl didn't have any status. If you had a
Yeah.
girl as a firstborn, she was never a Bechor. There's no such thing as a Bechorah. It's the firstborn son who is going to be the one who is going to take over the leadership of the family.
It just
So,
puzzled me, you know,
yeah, no,
when I
I
was
understand,
reading
but it's referring to the son.
it.
So
Okay.
then at midnight, God strikes down all the firstborn, and like he said he's going to do, and there was never a house without somebody that was going to be dead. Question is, what saves the Bnei Israel? What saves the Bnei Israel? What did they have to do to be saved?
The blood on the doorpost.
Right, they had to do something. In other words, in the plagues, when the plagues didn't affect the Bnei Israel, they didn't have to do anything, right? It didn't affect them. It affected the Egyptians, but the Israelites were not affected by the plagues. Here, in this last one, they had to do something in order not to be afflicted.
Put the lamb
Okay?
in 2 days
And
before.
and what they had to do is shecht a sheep and take some of the blood, put it on the doorpost, and God says, I will pass through the land of Egypt and strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, man and beast. But the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike. In other words, the Bnei Israel has to make a statement of their Jewish identity by putting the blood of the Zevach Pesach on the doorpost of their house, so that that house is considered a Jewish house. And which is why the the observance of this was the original Zebach Pesach on the night of the 14th, but the observance of it that we call Pesach, that we have to do every year on the 14th, on the evening of the 14th, is because we are declaring our Jewish identity. We're remembering the first event in which we had to declare our Jewish identity. The implication is that if you were an Israelite and you didn't put the blood on your doorpost of the house, in other words, you didn't proclaim your Jewish identity, then your firstborn died with all the Egyptians. In other words, the difference here is that before Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Bnei Israel had to declare themselves as Israelites. They had to show God that they have maintained their Jewish identity and they're not identifying as Egyptians or Egyptian slaves, that they are Israelites. And according to not only Torah Shebaal Peh, but according to the Navi later on, some major percent of the Bnei Israel did not identify as Israelites, remained in Egypt, and disappeared. They didn't come out. In order to declare yourself for God to save you, to redeem you, you had to declare yourself by putting the blood on the doorposts of the house. Then you can be freed from slavery. And not everybody did that. Not everybody did that.
But if you lost 2/3 of, or what was it, 4/5 of the people during the plague of darkness, wouldn't the others by automatically say, gee, I must be Jewish then? Why would they have to necessarily do this? God already pointed out the fact that they're part of the group.
Right, but again, what happened during darkness to the Bnei Israel is a medrash. It's not in the text. According to the text, nothing happened to the Bnei Israel during the darkness. That's the way we know. Then a medrash comes in and then starts telling you what could have happened. Okay, but nothing happened during the darkness. The only time. Now, this, by the way, we know from the laws of the Zevach Pesach, of bringing the Pesach offering, that if you are a Ben Nechar, if you're not an Israelite, you're not allowed to bring a Pesach offering. In other words, because this offering indicated your Jewish identity, only Jews who, the men had to be circumcised. You couldn't bring a Korban Pesach, and a man had to be circumcised to bring a Korban Pesach because it was the first statement of Jewish identity. And if you know your Nach, you know when the people ended up worshiping idols for generations and generations, whenever there was a reversal, whenever there was a getting rid of all the idols by only 2 of the kings, the first thing that they did was Korban Pesach, to reestablish their Jewish identity as Israelites and reject the service of serving the idols. And what was the first thing Yehoshua did when he brought the people into Eretz Yisrael? Pesach. He said, the first thing that you observe is Pesach, and you have to make sure that everybody was circumcised first, and that became the establishment of Jewish identity. And it's interesting, just anecdotally, that this symbol of Pesach as the proclamation of Jewish identity has survived to this day. Because if you would take a look at the entire Judaism, all the Jewish people, not just in Israel, but outside of Israel, throughout the generations, one of the things that they kept, almost the only thing they kept, was Seder, was the night, the Zevach Pesach, the feast, the family feast that we call the Seder, because that's a statement of your Jewish identity. Even if you don't do anything else, it's your Jewish identity, and it starts here. This is the prototype, the archetype that started the idea that the Zevach Pesach is a statement of Jewish identity, and that's maintained itself throughout our entire history. Did the other nations learn anything from these plagues and the whole experience? Yes, because look at the Shira that we're going to say next week. If you look at the English of the Shira, at the song of the Moshe's song, Az Yashir, it says,
Mhm.
the nations will hear and tremble. Anguish will grip the people of Philistia, the Philistines. The chiefs of Edom will be terrified. The leaders of Moab will be seized with trembling, and the people of Canaan will melt away in terror and dread. In other words, it worked. The message of God being able to destroy the most powerful nation in the ancient Near East. Egypt was the most powerful nation. The Israelite God was able to destroy them. Therefore, everybody else was terrified. And we know that even Yitro, when he joins Moshe, after they get to Har Sinai, Yitro said, praise be God, God meaning the Hebrew God, who rescued you from the hands of the Egyptians and of Pharaoh, and who rescued the people from the hand of Egyptians. In other words, he freed you, your people, to be from slavery. Now I know that God is greater than all other gods, for he did this to those who had treated Israel arrogantly. In other words, Yitro, who was a non-Jewish priest, a Midianite priest, got the message too. Everybody got the message that God is greater than all other gods. The question is, did the Bnei Israel learn their lesson
No,
about who God is?
didn't take
Well,
them
that
long.
we'll have to wait till next week and see what the Bnei Israel's reaction was.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was brilliant.
Okay.
Thank you. Looking forward
Have
to
a
next
good week.
Take care and have a good week.
You too.
We'll
Shavua
continue
tov.
the story next week. I see you're all dressed in red. How's that?
Yeah, I realise I'm
Very
That's
nice.
different red.
total accident. I
Uh,
hate it.